Arthur Moreira stood inside the glass-walled boardroom, his worn-out cardigan a stark contrast to the sleek, modern office. On the other side of the table, the young CEO, Ricardo Tavares, smirked. "Arthur, your methods are archaic." "You're a relic," he announced, his voice loud enough for the entire office to hear. "Quantum Leap needs disruptors, not dinosaurs. You're fired for being incapable of keeping up." Outside the glass, younger employees snickered, seeing only a quiet old man being put out to pasture. But they were blind. They didn't see the architect who had single-handedly designed the multi-billion-dollar AI they all relied on. They saw a liability. They were firing their foundation. Arthur simply nodded, a calm, unreadable expression on his face. He wasn't defeated. He was being set free. They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives, and he would make sure they knew it. His new company was already being born in his mind. The silence in the glass boardroom stretched for a moment, thick and heavy. Arthur's calm nod seemed to infuriate Ricardo more than any outburst could have. The young CEO wanted a scene, a breakdown, something to validate his power. He wasn't getting it. "Well? Nothing to say, Arthur?" Ricardo leaned forward, his knuckles white on the polished table. "No begging? No pleading for the job you've held onto for 20 years? Before Arthur could speak, the door hissed open. Julia Ferris strode in, a tablet in her hand and a triumphant smirk on her face. She didn't even glance at Arthur, addressing only Ricardo. "The termination papers are ready for his signature, Ricardo. And I've already scheduled a future-forward meeting with the Nexus team this afternoon. We can finally move forward at the speed of innovation. No more bottlenecks." The word bottlenecks was aimed directly at Arthur, a verbal dagger she'd been using against him in meetings for months. He had always advocated for methodical, careful progress, for testing and perfecting every line of code. Julia called it stalling. She saw his careful craftsmanship as a weakness, an obstacle to her own rapid ascent up the corporate ladder. Outside the glass, Lucas Andrade, the arrogant lead developer, had gathered a small audience of junior programmers. He made a show of pointing at Arthur, then pantomimed a slow, shuffling walk, clutching his back like a frail old man. Laughter rippled through the group. They were young, hungry, and believed completely in the cult of youth and speed that Ricardo had fostered. Arthur was a ghost from a bygone era they were happy to see exorcised. Ricardo's eyes gleamed, feeding on the public display. "You see, Arthur? The future is already moving on without you." He gestured to a large screen on the wall, and a slide appeared showing a complex graph with a slight dip. "This is your legacy. Stagnation. The Nexus core, your precious creation, is a relic. It's bloated, inefficient. We have a new team, led by Lucas, that's going to rebuild it from scratch. Something modern, something agile." It was a staggering lie. The Nexus core was the most elegant and efficient piece of AI code on the planet, so advanced that Lucas and his team could barely understand its foundational principles, let alone replicate them. They had spent months trying to add superficial features, breaking core functionalities that Arthur would then quietly fix overnight. He was the system's silent guardian, and they were celebrating his execution. Arthur looked from the fraudulent graph to Julia's smug face. He knew she had manipulated the data, it was her specialty. He'd seen her do it to sideline other colleagues. He'd just never imagined he would be the final target. He reached for the tablet she held out, his hand perfectly steady. The screen displayed a termination agreement with a paltry severance package, conditioned on a non-disclosure and non-compete clause that was laughably restrictive. He scrolled through it once, his eyes not missing a single word. He knew the non-compete was likely unenforceable, but he also knew they were counting on him being too old and tired to fight it. "Sign it, Arthur, and we can make this painless," Ricardo said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "A man your age should be thinking about retirement, not legal battles." Arthur remained silent. He tapped his signature onto the screen. It was a simple, clean signature, just like his code. He pushed the tablet back across the table. His part in this charade was over. Excellent, Ricardo chirped, standing up. Julia, have security escort Mr. Moreira from the premises. Immediately. He's not to return to his desk. And have that desk cleared by lunch. We need the space for someone with vision. 2 uniformed security guards, who had been waiting discreetly by the elevators, entered the room. They were large men, and their presence was a calculated final humiliation, meant to treat him like a threat, a criminal. One stood on either side of him. This way, sir, one of them said, his voice professionally flat but his eyes holding a hint of pity. Arthur stood, adjusted his worn cardigan, and picked up his old nylon backpack. He didn't look at Ricardo or Julia again. As the guards led him out of the boardroom, a hush fell over the open-plan office. Every head turned. The snickering stopped, replaced by the uncomfortable, voyeuristic silence of a public shaming. He could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on him. Lucas Andrade stood with his arms crossed, a broad, arrogant grin plastered on his face, making sure everyone saw him enjoying the show. Arthur kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. He walked past the breakout areas with their colorful beanbags, past the micro-kitchen with its gleaming espresso machine, past the wall of patents where his own name was listed more than a dozen times. Each step was a quiet farewell to the world he had built. His sensible shoes made almost no sound on the polished concrete floor. It was the walk of a man who had been erased. The guards led him to the main elevators, their keycards already out. The ride down from the 40th floor was silent. When the doors opened into the grand, marble-flooded lobby, the finality of the moment settled in. They didn't stop until he was outside, standing on the granite steps under the towering steel and glass facade of the Quantum Leap Tech headquarters. The automatic doors slid shut behind him, sealing him out. He was on the sidewalk, alone, with nothing but his backpack and 20 years of work that had been declared worthless. The city traffic roared around him, but in his mind, there was only a profound and perfect silence. The stage was now set. For a long time, Arthur simply stood there, the city's indifferent current flowing around him. The Quantum Leap Tower loomed at his back, a monument of glass and steel that now felt like a foreign country. He looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a builder, a creator. For 2 decades, they had typed the code that built an empire. Now, they were empty. He slipped them into the pockets of his cardigan, turned, and began to walk. He didn't go far. Just 2 blocks away, nestled between a vape shop and a trendy new gym, was a small, family-owned coffee shop named The Daily Grind. It was a relic of an older city, with worn wooden tables and the comforting smell of roasted coffee and old books. It was his sanctuary, the place he went to think. He ordered a black coffee, the same order he'd had for 15 years, and sat at his usual table in the back corner. He pulled out his personal laptop from his backpack. As the machine whirred to life, his phone buzzed on the table. A news alert from a major tech publication. The headline was a sharp, painful sting. Quantum Leap Tech announces major restructuring for aggressive innovation, parts ways with veteran engineer. Ricardo was wasting no time spinning the narrative. The article painted a picture of a dynamic, forward-thinking company shedding dead weight to achieve its full potential. They didn't use Arthur's name, but they didn't have to. Anyone in the industry would know who the veteran engineer behind Nexus was. Then came the second wave of the assault, this one more personal. He opened his browser to a professional networking site. Julia Ferez had already published an article, a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak titled, Shedding Legacy Frameworks, The Courage to Build Anew. It was filled with buzzwords like synergy, paradigm shift, and future-proofing, and it was a thinly veiled assassination of Arthur's entire professional philosophy. It praised Ricardo's bold vision and ended with a promise that Quantum Leap was now unshackled from the limitations of the past. Worse still was a post from Lucas Andrade. It was a selfie of him and his team, all grinning, huddled in a conference room. The caption read, "Meet the new architects of tomorrow. The Dream Team is officially taking the reins. Get ready for Nexus 2.0. Hashtag innovation, hashtag no dinosaurs, hashtag Quantum Leap." The post was flooded with likes and congratulatory comments from industry peers. Arthur stared at the screen, the coffee growing cold in his hands. It wasn't the public firing or the condescending remarks that truly hurt. It was this. The complete and utter desecration of his life's work. Nexus wasn't a legacy framework, it was an elegant, evolving intelligence he had nurtured from a single line of code into something magnificent. And these people, these arrogant, short-sighted children, were going to tear it apart. They would bolt on useless features, create security holes with their clumsy code, and optimize it for marketing demos instead of genuine performance. They would turn his Sistine Chapel into a billboard. A profound sense of anger, cold and clear, began to solidify within him. It wasn't the hot, reckless anger of a wounded ego. It was the calculated fury of a master craftsman watching vandals deface his masterpiece. They hadn't just fired him. They had declared war on the very principles of quality, elegance, and thoughtful creation he stood for. He closed the news articles. He closed the networking site. He knew what he had to do. His fight wasn't for severance pay or for his old job. It was for the soul of his creation. He had to prove them wrong. He had to show the world what Nexus was truly capable of, free from the suffocating ignorance of corporate greed. This was the challenge, laid bare and brutal. It was him, a 50-year-old man with modest savings and a battered laptop, against a billion-dollar behemoth with an army of marketers and developers. They had the money, the power, and the narrative. It was an impossible fight. A fool's errand. He took a slow sip of his now lukewarm coffee. A faint smile touched his lips for the first time that day. They had left him with nothing, but they had also taken his chains. He was no longer bound by their meetings, their deadlines, their foolish demands. He was free to simply create. He opened a new document. The page was blank, white, and full of potential. At the top, he typed a name for his new venture. Not a flashy, aggressive name like Quantum Leap, but something that spoke of perfection, of an ideal state. He typed Elysian Systems. He then opened a code editor. The familiar black screen with its stark, monospaced font felt like coming home. His fingers, which had felt so empty just an hour before, found the keyboard. And with a quiet, steady rhythm, he began to type the first lines of a new AI core. It wouldn't be a copy of Nexus. It would be its successor. What Nexus could have been, what it should have been. The impossible challenge had been set, not by Ricardo, but by his own unyielding principles. And in the quiet corner of a forgotten coffee shop, Arthur Moreira accepted it. The first stone of a new empire had just been laid. Arthur is at his lowest point, but he's also at his most powerful. He's about to build an empire from a coffee shop, armed with nothing but his genius and a righteous anger. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or told you were a relic from the past, then this story is for you. Before we see how he forges his weapon to take down a giant, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support allows us to keep telling stories about the quiet masters who prove the world wrong. You don't want to miss what happens next. 6 months passed. To the glittering world of tech, Arthur Moreira had simply vanished. He was a forgotten footnote in Quantum Leap's aggressive march toward the future. But in a small, windowless server room he rented on the outskirts of the city, Arthur wasn't just surviving, he was creating a masterpiece. The space was humble, a chaotic nest of humming servers, tangled cables, and empty coffee cups. It was the complete antithesis of Quantum Leap's pristine headquarters, but here, free from distractions and deadlines, Arthur was in his element. He had named his new AI core Arate, an ancient Greek word for excellence and moral virtue. It was a name that embodied his entire philosophy. He didn't work with a team, his only companion was the quiet, steady hum of the machines. His process was one of monastic devotion. While Quantum Leap's developers were holding frantic meetings and writing thousands of lines of clumsy, feature-heavy code for Nexus 2.0, Arthur was practicing the art of subtraction. His code was like poetry, lean, elegant, and devastatingly efficient. He rewrote entire modules if he found a way to make them a single byte smaller or a nanosecond faster. He wasn't building a product, he was sculpting a digital soul. The result was breathtaking. R8 was everything Nexus should have been. It could understand nuance and subtext in ways that made other AIs look like simple calculators. It could generate code that was cleaner than a human's, compose music with genuine emotional depth, and solve complex logical problems with a terrifying grace. Most importantly, it was built on a foundation of ethical principles, hard-coded by Arthur to prevent misuse and manipulation. It was 10 times more powerful and 100 times more efficient than the system Quantum Leap was currently running into the ground. Meanwhile, at the Quantum Leap Tower, the cracks were beginning to show. Lucas Andrade and his team, tasked with reverse engineering Arthur's genius, were failing spectacularly. In their arrogance, they'd ripped out core modules they didn't understand, replacing them with trendy but unstable code. Nexus was becoming slow, buggy, and unreliable. Major clients were starting to complain about system crashes and nonsensical outputs. Ricardo and Julia worked furiously to conceal the decay, pouring millions into a massive marketing campaign for the upcoming launch of Nexus 2.0, promising it would be the biggest revolution in AI history. They were selling a hollow shell, and the launch date was looming. Arthur knew he couldn't compete on marketing. He had no budget, no PR team, no platform. He had only the quiet, undeniable truth of his creation. To reveal it, he needed a voice of unimpeachable authority, someone the industry trusted implicitly. He needed Dr. Alastair Finch. Dr. Finch was a legend, a semi-retired MIT professor and the industry's most revered and feared critic. His blog, The Unvarnished Code, was gospel. He was famously curmudgeonly, brutally honest, and had eviscerated billion-dollar products for minor logical fallacies. He was unreachable, incorruptible, and Arthur's only hope. From a newly created, anonymous email address, Arthur sent a message to the public contact on Dr. Finch's blog. The subject line was simple, an alternative approach. The body of the email contained only one sentence: Dr. Finch, I believe you might find this demonstration of a new generative AI architecture of interest. Your honest assessment would be valued. Below it was a simple, secure link. No company name, no marketing pitch, no hype. In his quiet, book-lined study in Boston, Alastair Finch saw the email and sighed. Another one. He received dozens of these a day from arrogant startups claiming to have reinvented the wheel. His policy was to delete them on sight. But this one was different. Its stark simplicity, its lack of bragging, was intriguing. Against his better judgment, he clicked the link. A minimalist interface appeared on his screen with a single prompt box. No logo, no name, just the words, "Ask me anything." Alastair smirked. He would break this thing in seconds. He started with his favorite AI killer, a complex ethical problem involving a self-driving car and impossible choices, a problem designed to expose the cold, unfeeling logic of most systems. He typed it in and hit enter. The response was instantaneous. It was not a sterile calculation of probabilities. It was a nuanced, philosophical treatise on utilitarianism versus deontology, written with the clarity of a seasoned ethicist. It didn't just answer the question, it understood the humanity behind it. Alastair sat bolt upright, his heart suddenly beating faster. He threw another, harder problem at it, a request to write a short story in the style of a famous author, but with a thematic twist that required a deep, almost human understanding of the author's personal tragedies. R8 delivered a story so perfect, so heartbreakingly authentic, that Alastair felt a chill run down his spine. For an hour, he hammered the anonymous AI with the most difficult prompts in his arsenal. He tested its logic, its creativity, its mathematical prowess, its coding ability. It never failed. It never hesitated. It was flawless. He leaned back in his leather chair, his mind reeling. He had spent the last month reading the breathless press releases about Quantum Leap's Nexus 2.0. He had seen their flashy, pre-rendered demo videos. It was all hype, a slick coat of paint on old technology. But this was different. This was a quantum leap, a genuine paradigm shift. This was the work of a master. He didn't know who had built it, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was looking at the future of artificial intelligence. His fingers, trembling slightly, moved to his own keyboard. He opened a new draft on his blog, The Unvarnished Code. He ignored the mountain of other articles he was supposed to be writing. This was the only story that mattered now. His fingers flew, his mind ablaze with what he had just witnessed. At the top of the page, he typed the title of his next post, I have just seen the future of AI, and its name is not Nexus. Dr. Finch hit publish. The effect was not like a pebble dropping into a pond, it was like an asteroid strike. Within an hour, his blog post had crashed its own server. It was copied and reposted on every major tech forum and news aggregator on the planet. By noon, Nexus and #FindTheCreator were trending topics on social media. The article was a masterclass in controlled demolition. Finch didn't just praise the anonymous AI, which he had dubbed the Air8 system after the single word he found in its source code comments. He systematically and mercilessly exposed the Emperor's new clothes, using Quantum Leap's own marketing jargon to tear apart the claims for Nexus 2.0. He wrote, Quantum Leap promises a paradigm shift, but shows us only a prettier user interface. They boast of unprecedented power, but their own technical specs suggest a bloated, inefficient core. It is the loud, desperate cry of a company that has lost its way. In stark contrast, the Air8 system is silent, elegant, and possesses a terrifying, beautiful intellect. It is the work of a singular, focused genius, not a committee of marketers. This is not an iteration, it is a revelation. He ended the post with a question that echoed through every boardroom in Silicon Valley, the creator of this marvel is unknown. Quantum Leap launches their future next week. I ask you, which horse are you betting on? The shockwave hit the 40th floor of the Quantum Leap Tower at precisely 9:05 a.m. Julia Ferris saw it first, her perfectly curated social media feed suddenly flooded with links to Finch's article. The color drained from her face. She snatched her tablet and stormed into Ricardo's glass-walled office without knocking. We have a problem, she said, her voice tight with panic. Ricardo, who was practicing his keynote speech for the Nexus 2.0 launch, waved her away. Whatever it is, handle it. You don't understand, she insisted, shoving the tablet into his hands. Alastair Finch just publicly executed us. Ricardo's confident smile vanished as he read. His face cycled through disbelief, then irritation, then pure, narcissistic rage. Finch? Who paid him off? This is a corporate espionage hit piece. A smear campaign. He slammed his fist on his desk. It's vaporware. Some jealous rival trying to sabotage our launch. Get our legal team on this now. He summoned Lucas Andrade to his office. The young developer swaggered in, confident as ever, but stopped short at the sight of Ricardo's furious expression. Ricardo threw the tablet at him. Some anonymous ghost has apparently built a better Nexus, and Finch is calling it a masterpiece. Explain this. Now. Lucas's smirk faded as he began to read. He skipped the marketing commentary and went straight to the technical descriptions, the analysis of Air8's architecture, its processing efficiency, its contextual learning model. His arrogance began to visibly crumble, replaced by a sickly, creeping dread. The architectural philosophy Finch was describing, the radical efficiency, the elegant minimalism, it was hauntingly familiar. It was the same logic he had spent the last 6 months mocking and trying to rip out of the original Nexus core. A logic he had never truly understood. This isn't possible, Lucas stammered, looking up from the screen, his face pale. The performance metrics he's citing, the neural network structure, it's perfect. It's what I thought we were building, but this is 100 years ahead. So it's real? Ricardo snarled. The theory is real, Lucas admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But to actually build it, to make it work, the man who wrote this code would have to be. He trailed off, the name catching in his throat. The three of them stood in the boardroom, the same room where they had fired Arthur, the atmosphere now thick with panic instead of triumph. Who could have done this? Ricardo demanded, pacing back and forth. Is it Google? Apple? Who has a secret AI project this advanced? Julia, ever the damage control specialist, was already formulating a plan. It doesn't matter. We deny. We issue a press release calling it a sophisticated hoax. We say Finch was duped. We can weather this. But Lucas wasn't listening. He was staring at the wall, a horrible, sickening realization dawning in his mind. He remembered Arthur's quiet warnings about system integrity. He remembered the elegant, handwritten diagrams in Arthur's old notebooks, diagrams he had thrown in the trash. He remembered the man he had called a dinosaur. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. There was only one person on the planet with the deep, foundational genius to build something like this. He finally understood. They hadn't just discarded a relic. They had unleashed a legend. While they panicked, Arthur made his move. He had watched the firestorm ignite online, just as he had predicted. Finch's article had created the opening. He didn't need an army of marketers. He just needed to claim his work. From the quiet of his server room, he executed the final step of his plan. He pushed a simple website live. It was for the domain he had registered months ago, https://www.google.com/search?q=ElesianSystems.com. The page was a study in minimalist confidence. It featured a simple, elegant logo and a single sentence, the home of Air8. Below it was an open invitation to join a waiting list for enterprise client demos. And at the very bottom of the page, in a clean, sans serif font, were two words that would bring Quantum Leap to its knees. Founder, Arthur Moreira. Back in the Quantum Leap boardroom, one of Julia's frantic assistants burst in. "You need to see this," the assistant said, pointing to her laptop screen. The creator, he just revealed himself. Julia, Ricardo, and Lucas crowded around the small screen. And there it was. The simple website. The elegant logo. And the name. Arthur Moreira. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an entire empire realizing it had just been checkmated. The faces of Ricardo and Julia froze in masks of horror. Lucas looked like he had seen a ghost, the ghost of the man whose genius they had stolen, mocked, and thrown away, now returned as their executioner. The name Arthur Moreira on the screen was not just a revelation, it was a verdict. In the wider tech world, the story assembled itself with the brutal, instantaneous logic of a chemical reaction. Journalists and industry bloggers connected the dots in a flurry of activity. The narrative was perfect, an irresistible corporate fable for the digital age. The visionary genius, cast out by arrogant, ignorant successors, goes into exile and forges a weapon so perfect it renders his former empire obsolete. Quantum Leap was no longer the story's hero. They were the fools who had thrown away the master key to their own kingdom. And Arthur Moreira was no longer a forgotten ghost. He was the master, returned to demonstrate what true innovation looked like. Dr. Alastair Finch provided the finishing blow. He published a short, devastating follow-up to his original post. It read, "It has been confirmed that the creator of the Air8 system is Arthur Moreira. For those who don't know their history, this is the man who was the original architect of the Nexus core. What we are witnessing is not just an innovation, it is a poetic and profound justice. I have reached out to Mr. Moreira to request the first official interview with Elysian Systems." The post didn't just add fuel to the fire, it was a tanker truck of gasoline. When the stock market opened the next morning, Quantum Leap stock, QL Tech, didn't just dip, it plummeted. Pre-market trading saw it lose 30% of its value before the opening bell even rang. Ricardo's phone began to ring incessantly. It was their major enterprise clients, the bedrock of their revenue. The calls were all the same, nervous questions, demands for reassurance, and thinly veiled threats to pull their multi-million-dollar contracts. The waiting list for Elysian Systems, meanwhile, had grown to include half the Fortune 500. In an act of supreme hubris and desperation, Ricardo refused to cancel the Nexus 2.0 launch event scheduled for that afternoon. "We will not be defeated by a ghost and a blogger," he snarled at his terrified executive team. "We will go on stage, show them the future, and this will all be forgotten." The launch event was a catastrophe. The grand auditorium, meant to be packed with fawning journalists and excited investors, was morbidly quiet and half-empty. The reporters who did show up were not there to celebrate. They were sharks that smelled blood in the water. Ricardo took the stage, his usual charismatic smile looking forced and brittle. He launched into his slick, pre-rehearsed speech, but the words about synergy and disruption sounded hollow and pathetic in the tense room. During the Q&A, the first hand shot up. It was a reporter from a top tech journal. "Mr. Tavares, can you comment on the fact that your company's founding engineer has apparently built a superior AI in just 6 months, working alone, after you fired him for being incapable?" Ricardo stammered, calling the claims unverified and speculation. The next question was even sharper. "Is it true that Nexus 2.0 is suffering from major stability issues and that you are covering it up with marketing?" He tried to deflect, to bluster, but his composure was cracking. He was losing control. Then, at the very peak of his public implosion, a journalist in the front row looked down at her phone, her eyes widening. She stood up, interrupting him mid-sentence. "Mr. Tavares, a news alert," she announced, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Elysian Systems has just officially launched. It's live for its first wave of enterprise clients as of right now. Dr. Alastair Finch is reportedly their first customer, and he is live-streaming his company's integration of the Arrayed AI. Right now." A murmur swept through the audience. In a single, unified motion, nearly every person in the room pulled out their phone. They weren't looking at Ricardo anymore. On dozens of small screens, they were watching a live feed from Dr. Finch's office. The elderly professor was demonstrating Arrayed's power in real time, feeding it impossible tasks. "Translate this entire legal document from German to Japanese, and summarize the key liability clauses in plain English," he commanded. Arrayed did it in 3 seconds. "Now, write a Python script to optimize our server logistics based on this real-time weather data." The flawless code appeared instantly. Arthur Moreira was nowhere to be seen on the stream. It was just his work, pure and undeniable, speaking for itself. Back in the auditorium, the spell was broken. People began to stand up, their attention completely captured by the live stream. They started to talk amongst themselves, their voices buzzing with excitement over what they were seeing on their phones. Then, they began to walk out. Not in a rush, but in a slow, steady exodus that was far more damning. They were leaving a funeral to attend a birth. Ricardo stood frozen on the massive stage, his face pale, bathed in the glow of the spotlights. The giant screen behind him displayed the gleaming logo for Nexus 2.0, the future is here. He was left utterly alone, a king in an empty castle, his desperate promises echoing in a room that no longer cared to listen. His humiliation was absolute, public, and complete. Miles away, in his quiet server room, Arthur Moreira was not watching the disastrous launch event. He had 2 windows open on his main monitor. One showed the steady, controlled onboarding of his first clients. The other showed the stock price of QL Tech. It was no longer a gentle slope, it was a vertical, blood-red waterfall. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. There was no triumphant smile on his face, only the calm, quiet satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had finally, and irrevocably, spoken the truth. The war was over. The aftermath of the failed launch was not just a news cycle, it was a cultural moment in the tech industry. The story of Arthur Moreira became a modern-day fable, whispered in boardrooms and Slack channels across the globe. They called it the Elysian Gambit. He was no longer just an engineer, he was a symbol of quiet competence, a patron saint for every brilliant, overlooked employee who had ever been silenced by a charismatic but clueless boss. Tech journals wrote breathless editorials not just about the power of his AI, but about the profound, undeniable power of substance over style. The photo of Ricardo Tavares standing alone on the empty stage became a viral meme, captioned with slogans like hubris or "This is what happens when marketing fires engineering." The world that had cast Arthur out was now desperately trying to get back in. Elysian Systems was flooded with so many client requests that its waiting list had a waiting list. More significantly, it was inundated with resumes. The brightest minds in AI, the most sought-after engineers from every major tech company, were sending their applications. They weren't just looking for a job, they were making a pilgrimage. They wanted to work for the master, for the man who had reminded the entire industry what truly mattered. Arthur, the dinosaur, now had his pick of the planet's most elite talent. His victory, however, was as humble as his origins. There were no champagne-fueled parties or triumphant press conferences. Arthur's new headquarters was a modest, functional office space, clean, well-lit, but devoid of the extravagant luxuries of Quantum Leap. His new, hand-picked team was small, comprised of engineers who shared his philosophy, quiet, brilliant, and dedicated to the craft. He politely declined Dr. Finch's interview request, and every other request that followed, with a simple, consistent message: "Thank you for your interest. We believe the work should speak for itself." This refusal to take a victory lap only amplified his legend. In a world of loudmouthed CEOs and self-proclaimed visionaries, his silence was the most powerful statement of all. For Arthur, the true reward wasn't the rapidly growing bank account or the industry adoration. It was seeing R8 being used for meaningful purposes. He prioritized contracts with medical research facilities, climate science organizations, and universities. He watched as his creation helped scientists model complex protein folding, predict extreme weather patterns, and accelerate the search for new medicines. He had built not just a smarter AI, but a better one. His victory was not in the defeat of his enemies, but in the validation of his life's philosophy. Back at the crumbling fortress of Quantum Leap, the karmic justice was swift and brutal. The company was in freefall. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting that lasted for 17 hours. The air was thick with fury and the stench of financial ruin. Ricardo Tavares was the primary target. He had become a pariah overnight. He locked himself in his office, the blinds drawn, ignoring the hundreds of furious calls from investors. He scrolled endlessly through his social media feeds, watching in horror as his carefully constructed image as a tech wunderkind was systematically dismantled and replaced with that of a fool and a charlatan. The meme of him on the empty stage was everywhere, a digital ghost that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was no longer a CEO, he was a cautionary tale. Julia Ferez, true to her nature, immediately shifted into self-preservation mode. She saw that the ship was sinking and her only goal was to secure a lifeboat for herself. She spent the board meeting deflecting all blame, claiming she had been a lone voice of caution against Ricardo's reckless strategies. She secretly leaked selected emails and chat logs to sympathetic journalists, carefully curating a narrative that painted Ricardo as a lone tyrant and herself as a pragmatic subordinate who had been overruled. Her betrayal was as transparent as it was shameless, and while it might save her from immediate legal trouble, her reputation in the industry was permanently stained. She was marked as disloyal, a political operator no one could ever trust again. For Lucas Andrade, the fallout was internal and far more profound. His arrogance, the central pillar of his identity, had been shattered into a million pieces. He finally understood the vast, cavernous gap between his own abilities and Arthur's genius. He saw the truth: he was a decent programmer, but he was no artist, no architect. He had mocked a master, and in doing so, had exposed his own mediocrity to the world. He couldn't look his own team in the eyes. He walked through the half-empty office, the silence of failure now deafening, knowing he was personally responsible for gutting the very system that had given him a career. He was a fraud, and the worst part was, he now knew it. The marathon board meeting finally concluded. A decision had been reached. A grim-faced communications director was tasked with drafting the press release that would be the first step in a long, arduous attempt to save the company from utter collapse. She sat at her keyboard and began to type the first, inevitable sentence. It read, "For immediate release, the Board of Directors of Quantum Leap Tech announced today the termination, effective immediately, of Chief Executive Officer Ricardo Tavares." The press release announcing Ricardo's termination was only the first domino to fall. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of Quantum Leap's mismanagement became public. An internal audit, demanded by furious investors, revealed that Ricardo and his inner circle had been actively suppressing reports about Nexus 2.0's instability for months. Faced with catastrophic losses and a barrage of shareholder lawsuits, the board had no choice but to clean house. Ricardo Tavares was not only fired, but also sued by the very company he once led for gross negligence and deliberately misleading investors. His golden parachute was rescinded, and his personal fortune became entangled in years of ruinous litigation. He was last seen by the press leaving a law office, his face pale and drawn, a man who had flown too close to the sun and had his wings of wax utterly melted away. Julia Ferraz's calculated betrayal did not yield the results she had hoped for. While she avoided a lawsuit, her reputation was destroyed. The leaked documents, which she had hoped would frame her as a whistleblower, also exposed her own history of taking credit for Arthur's work. She was fired 1 week after Ricardo for unethical conduct and professional dishonesty. The industry, it turned out, had a long memory for backstabbers. No reputable tech firm would hire her for an executive role. She eventually took a mid-level project manager position at a struggling startup, her meteoric rise crashing back to earth, forced to work in the very kind of mediocrity she had always scorned. Lucas Andrade's fate was quieter, but in some ways, more complete. He wasn't fired. Instead, the new management team, in a desperate attempt to salvage Nexus, brought in a team of veteran AI architects, serious, methodical engineers who were, in essence, men just like Arthur. Lucas was demoted and forced to work under them. It was a daily lesson in his own inadequacy. They would ask him questions about the core logic he couldn't answer and patiently explain the foundational principles that he had once arrogantly dismissed. The quiet, professional competence of the new team was a constant, crushing reminder of his own fraudulent bravado. After 3 months of this slow-motion humiliation, he resigned. The last anyone heard, he had enrolled in a master's program for computer science, effectively starting his career over from the very beginning, finally forced to learn the lessons he had been so sure he'd already mastered. 1 year later, Elysian Systems was the undisputed leader in generative AI. Its technology was helping to solve some of the world's most complex problems. But its founder was not on the cover of magazines or giving speeches at global tech conferences. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Arthur Moreira sat in his usual corner at the Daily Grind. The coffee shop was unchanged, a small island of comforting authenticity in a rapidly changing city. He wore a simple gray cardigan and was sketching a new neural network concept in a worn leather-bound notebook. A young woman, one of his lead engineers, approached his table hesitantly. "Sorry to bother you outside the office, Arthur," she said, "but I had a breakthrough on the language model compression." Arthur looked up and smiled, his eyes bright with genuine curiosity. "That's wonderful news, Maria. Tell me everything." He listened intently as she excitedly explained her complex idea, treating her not as a subordinate, but as a respected peer. He was not a king on a throne, he was a master craftsman in his workshop, and he was happiest when surrounded by fellow builders. After she left, he took a sip of his coffee. Through the window, he could see the distant peak of the Quantum Leap Tower, a building he rarely thought about anymore. His success hadn't changed him. He still lived in the same modest house. He had used a significant portion of his new wealth to establish the Moreira Foundation, a nonprofit that provided scholarships and mentorship to promising engineering students from low-income backgrounds. His triumph was not measured in stock prices or market share. It was measured in this: the freedom to create, the ability to help others, and the quiet peace of living a life true to his own principles. He had been fired for being incapable, but his capability was never up for debate in the only place it mattered, within himself. They hadn't taken anything from him that day, they had merely revealed to the world a truth he had known all along. His value was not dependent on their approval. He picked up his pen and went back to his notebook, a quiet man building a better future, one elegant line at a time. Arthur's story is a powerful reminder that your value is never determined by those who are too blind to see it. True skill and integrity are quiet forces, but they are unstoppable. In the end, flashy marketing and loud arrogance will always crumble against the silent, steady pressure of genuine excellence. Have you ever been underestimated or had your contributions overlooked? We want to hear about it. Share your story in the comments below, and let's create a community that celebrates the quiet victories. Your experiences matter, and they inspire countless others. If you believe that substance will always win over style, hit that follow button. By joining us, you help us continue to tell stories that matter, stories of justice, vindication, and the undeniable power of being true to your craft. Thank you for watching.